This is part 2 of an 8-part series on the meanings of the prophecies in the book of Daniel. In this part 2, we will learn about Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great tree and a holy messenger who comes down from heaven. Hidden things will be discovered and explained, such as a hidden time prophecy that will tell us when and where the Messiah of the latter days is to appear. But before you go any further, if you have not yet seen part 1 of this 8-part series, which is an introduction to the book of Daniel and the review of chapter 2 prophecies, I would advise you to go back and watch part 1 first, and I'll tell you shortly how to get to all of my videos. If you have not seen part 1 yet, you can find it back by going to the YouTube and entering into the search box my channel name, Integral Destiny 9, that you see on the screen, and look for the title Book of Daniel Part 1, and that is also how you access the other parts of this Book of Daniel and my other videos. This video, part 2 in the series, covers the prophecies in Daniel's dream of the great tree, found in chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. What is reviewed here is how these prophecies have been fulfilled by events in our time. To be clear, this is the second video in a series of 8 videos which explain the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah of the Second Advent, who is also the Messiah to the Jews who expect his coming for the foretold 7th millennium of God's Sabbath week. Not every chapter in the book of Daniel has a prophecy in it of any import at this time, the end times. This video series will only cover those chapters that have some relevancy to the visions of the latter days or end times. The chapter of Daniel in this table is on the far left column, and the video that covers that chapter is on the far right in this table. Video number 1 covers chapter 2, which is the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the kingdoms that will replace his until the time of the end, the last days and the coming of the Messiah. Chapter 3 is not included. Video number 2 covers chapter 4, the dream of the great tree. That's the video you're in right now. Chapters 5 and chapter 6 are not included since they're not about the end times or the coming of the Messiah. And video number 3 reviews chapter 7 concerning the dream of the 4 beasts. Chapters 8 and 9 are combined into video number 4, or part number 4. These are the 2300 days prophecy and the 70 weeks prophecy. These prophecies give clear time windows for the coming of the Messiahs of both the Second Advent and the First Advent, meaning Jesus, respectively. Chapter 10 on Daniel's vision of a man is in video number 5. Now, chapter 11 has 2 sections. The first section is about the kings of the north and the south. The second section is about the king who exalts himself. The first section about the kings of the north and south don't deal with the coming of the new Messiah of the latter days, but I thought people might be interested in that part, the first section of that part. So I put an addendum that's in video or part number 8 of the series is about that first section of chapter 11. The second section, the king who exalts himself, is in video or part number 6. Chapter 12, which includes a message about the great prince Michael, is in video or part number 7. It is related to chapter 11. As a matter of fact, it's a continuation of chapter 11. So we're finally getting around to actually getting to chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. This video about chapter 4 is about a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has, a second dream he has, about a great tree. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream after the one we reviewed in part number 1 or video number 1, which covered chapter 2 of Daniel. This time in chapter 4, this dream is about a great tree and a holy messenger who comes down from heaven. So how are we going to do this in the video? How are we organized here? First, we will review the text of chapter 4 that bears on the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. I will be using the text from the New International Version of the Bible. This review gets a bit tedious, I know, but we need to know exactly what the Bible says, not just some very brief version that will not give the full context of the prophecy. This will include the text of Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great tree. And third, there is a hidden time prophecy that most people do not recognize in chapter 4. We will reveal it and its meaning. And so we start with a review of the text of the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel. And remember, patience is a virtue. Please note that quotes from the book of Daniel will have a yellow background to them. That will help you identify very easily when we're talking about verses of Daniel. Now we're starting chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. Quote, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. End quote. Daniel is announcing to all peoples of the whole world that this dream, meaning the prophecy, applies to all peoples, not just the Jewish people. Verse 3, quote, How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. End quote. Here Daniel praises God who has revealed this good news of the future. The comment about God's dominion enduring from generation to generation emphasizes that God has plans for us when we will be ready for them. Verses 4 to 6, quote, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. End quote. Once again, just like in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar gathers the wise men to interpret the dream. Also note that Nebuchadnezzar mentions that he was, quote, at home in my palace, contented and prosperous, end quote. Daniel uses the motif of King Nebuchadnezzar as a literary cover device, meaning a stand-in for humanity as a whole. In other words, references to King Nebuchadnezzar are really references to how humanity as a whole are acting, especially toward God and his laws. This use of the personage of King Nebuchadnezzar as a representative of the human spiritual condition as a whole is part of the hidden meanings in this chapter of Daniel. The phrase, quote, at home in my palace, contented and prosperous, end quote, is telling the reader that humanity was and would remain proud, self-satisfied, and world-bound until a time in the future. The quote-unquote king, being in his palace, contented and prosperous, shows that the king, meaning humanity, was rather smug and not recognizing that God is supreme and God's will was to be followed. We will find out when this materially bound, proud state of humankind would begin to end later in this prophecy. Nebuchadnezzar supposedly continues the narrative in verses 7 and 8, quote, When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, he being Daniel, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. End quote. Note that again Daniel was able to interpret the dream, and the other magicians, enchanters, etc. could not. By stating this, Daniel is not just self-aggrandizing here, but rather he is emphasizing that the one true God is the only source of this vision and Daniel's ability to interpret it. Verse 9, quote, I, and that's Nebuchadnezzar speaking, said, Belteshazzar, and remember that's Daniel, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you. and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream, interpret it for me." End quote. Keep in mind that this Belteshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar refers to is our Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel this name, and it means various things according to several sources, from prince of the king, from a Jewish source, to Bel, an idol god, protects his life, to keeper of secrets. The name Daniel means God is my judge. Verse 10, quote, "These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous." End quote. Verses 11 and 12, Nebuchadnezzar continuing his description of his dream, quote, "The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed." End quote. This is a great illustration of one artist's version of what Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream in the 4th chapter of Daniel. The source of this artwork is in the upper right corner from the website dwellingintheword.wordpress.com, the digital art by Ted Larson. The tree is growing out of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom as seen in this satellite photo of the Middle East. The tree is growing up where the Neo-Babylonian Empire was once located. And remember, the tree is described in verses 11 and 12 as, quote, "The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed." End quote. Those of you who actually saw part 1 of this series may remember this map of the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. The darker blue in the central area of the map shows the territory of the Neo-Babylonian Empire during the time of Daniel. Most historians count its duration as approximately 626 BC to 539 BC. This time period is also known as the Chaldean era, and some also refer to it as the 11th dynasty of the Babylonian kings. The Neo-Babylonian era ended with the invasion by Cyrus the Great of the Media-Persian Empire in 539 BC. This is the area where the great tree of Nebuchadnezzar's dream grew out of. On to verse 13, quote, "In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a Holy One, a messenger, coming down from heaven." End quote. This is a key verse. The vision is telling us that this is about a messenger of God who will come in the future. Coming down from heaven means he will be a divine spirit who comes from God's spiritual kingdom to appear on earth in the physical body of a seemingly human being. Verses to come will give us some clues as to when he, the Messiah, would appear. Verses 14 and 15, quote, "He, the holy messenger, called in a loud voice, 'Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from it and the birds from its branches, but let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field." End quote. Cutting down the tree and trimming it means that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom will weaken, then die, but the stump, the roots of the kingdom, will generate succeeding kingdoms that will coincide with the bronze and iron kingdoms mentioned in Nebuchadnezzar's first dream in chapter 2 of the statue of several metals. I hope you remember this rendition of Nebuchadnezzar's dream from chapter 2 about the statue with the head of gold. Each segment of the statue was of a different metal or a mixture of iron and clay for the feet. The head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom that would pass away. It would be succeeded by the silver kingdom, then the bronze, then the iron. The iron legs have feet of a mixture of iron and clay, meaning a divided kingdom. This statue of kingdoms will eventually be destroyed by the appearance of the Messiah and his forerunner, who are respectively Baha'u'llah and the Bab. See video part number 1 for more information about that. The second kingdom, the silver chest and arms, is the Medo-Persian or Medo-Persian Empire. It is not mentioned in this verse, but I don't think that omission is significant because it goes on to mention the bronze and iron roots of the tree. The third kingdom, the Bronze Kingdom, is the Greco-Roman Empire, meaning the Hellenistic period, because of the melding of the influence of both during the period from 335 BC to the 7th century Common Era. During this era, Greek culture and language flourished even during the time of the Roman Empire. Greek was still the language of the written word well into the Common Era times. The fourth kingdom, the legs of iron, including the feet, is the Islamic Empire, which began around 633 Common Era. But keep in mind that the religion of Islam began in 622. But it was only with the death of Muhammad in 632 Common Era that the leaders who succeeded him began a campaign of conquest and established an empire ruled by leaders who were Muslims. Thus we call it an Islamic empire. As mentioned in video number 1, Jewish and Christian Bible scholars have had blinders on for about 1400 years and really have just refused to recognize the existence of the Islamic Empire. Therefore, their interpretation of the dream has not been correct because of their rejection of Muhammad and the Islamic Empire established by his followers. The phrase in verse 15 stating, "The stump and its roots bound with iron and bronze remain in the ground," means that these kingdoms will come in the more distant future and will grow out of the same area and peoples as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We will learn later that the time period, the 1800s, is the time of the rock breaking free of the mountain to descend upon that area of the world to destroy the two prevailing kingdoms at that time, the remnants of the fourth kingdom of the Islamic Empire. The interactions of the Messiah, his forerunner, and the rulers of these kingdoms leads to the ultimate destruction of those kingdoms in the territory of Nebuchadnezzar's ancient realm. Finishing off verse 15 and then on to verse 16, quote, "Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him." End quote. Most interpretations of this have centered on King Nebuchadnezzar actually becoming like an animal himself for 7 times, meaning 7 years. Its prophetic meaning remained hidden, but we now know what the 7 times really means. We will get to that hidden meaning soon. Verse 17, quote, "The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to any one he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people." End quote. There is a reference to multiple messengers from God up to Daniel's time, such as Krishna, Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, and possibly Buddha. Those messengers who brought messages of one God. Note the teachings of the Messiah of the Second Advent, which I am telling you here has already appeared, is that Krishna's and Buddha's original messages were of one God, not multiple gods that are found now in Hinduism, and an actual denial of the existence of the one God by some Buddhists. These messengers work together to set in motion the occurrences that will result in the end of Nebuchadnezzar's empire and the nations and empires that would follow him in this part of the earth, as previously described, all leading up to the appearance of the Messiah of the Second Advent, also known as the Jewish Messiah of the 7th millennium. These messengers are making this announcement of their plans to Daniel in this dream of Nebuchadnezzar's. But perhaps you are finding this prophecy to be dull and not speaking of our future. Please stick it out, though. There is a very hidden meaning having effects on our times. Verses 18 and 19 quote, "This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you." Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, "Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you." Belteshazzar answered, "My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries." End quote. Again, the story of Daniel being asked to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So now we get to Daniel's interpretation of the dream of the great tree previously described. Now, it should be noted that they reiterate some of the same verbiage as mentioned before, so it does get a little redundant. We just have to bear with that. So, verses 20 through 22, quote, "The tree you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger, coming down from heaven and saying, 'Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him.'" End quote. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." End quote. Then it goes on to describe how the dream is fulfilled as follows, quote, "All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, 'Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?'" End quote. 12 months after the dream, nothing has changed. Nebuchadnezzar did not acknowledge that God in heaven rules all, and apparently did not renounce his sins, and was not kind to the oppressed, probably by not freeing the Jews from captivity. As Nebuchadnezzar states in the verses, he built the royal residence by his mighty power, not God's, and for the glory of his own majesty, not God's. Thus his punishment became effective. To continue at verse 31, quote, "Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. 'This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like an ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, meaning after the 7 times or 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. This is a timeline graphic of when this dream occurred to Nebuchadnezzar. Note on the far left, above the year 605 BCE, the first year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, you will see a note that ends, reign begin. I've abbreviated Nebuchadnezzar's name down to a simple N in diagrams like this. If only he had had a shorter name. Then you see that the second year of his reign, 603 BCE, before Common Era, noted at the bottom and in blue, if you can see colors, that is the year that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream about the tree. Then the Bible says that it was 12 months later, after the second year of his reign, that his dream was supposedly literally fulfilled. However, the symbolic fulfillment of the prophecy would not occur until 7 times in prophecy later. So the year 602 BCE is the beginning of the 7 times. This will be explained in more depth later. So remember, this year, 602 BCE, is when the 7 times period begins. So we continue with verse 34. Quote, His, God's dominion, is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, What have you done? At the same time that my, Nebuchadnezzar's, sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. End quote. And end of chapter 4 about the great tree. So, big deal, you may be thinking. It may also be that you think all this has already happened. Wasn't this vision about the long-dead King Nebuchadnezzar? He turned into an animal, then came back to his senses. Story over. You may be thinking that whatever is hidden in this prophecy is really well hidden. First, we have to set the timing of the beginning of the prophecy. Daniel gives the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as the date when the king began to have troubling dreams. That year was 603 BCE. Then verse 29 mentions that the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's madness as after 12 months. That puts the year of the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's punishment by God in the year 602 BCE. Daniel emphasizes that the span of time that Nebuchadnezzar would be mad as, quote, Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. End quote. Then again in verse 23, quote, Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times passes by for him. End quote. Then a couple verses later in verse 25, that's the part that's underlined here on the slide, it states, quote, 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone who wishes. End quote. Hidden meaning alert here. Alert, alert. The secret of this dream in chapter 4 is that the described fulfillment is a hidden prophecy within a prophecy. You need to know the meanings of Bible time prophecy terms. A prophetic year is equal to 360 days, prophetic days. A quote-unquote time is one prophetic year of 360 days. A prophetic month is 30 days. A prophetic day is equal to 1 earthly year. That leads us to the question, what does 7 times mean? If Nebuchadnezzar was to be punished 7 times, what does that mean in terms of time, since this is a prophecy? Since it's a prophecy, prophetic time terms then apply. So a time in Bible prophecy is 1 year of 360 days. To really get an in-depth explanation, see video number 4 of this series. So 7 times equals 7 times 360, that's as in 360 days in a prophetic year, which is equal to 2,520 days. 2,520 days, because each day symbolizes a 1 earth year, it means 2,520 earth years. To determine when 2,520 solar years end, we subtract 602, as in the 602 BCE date, from the 2,520. We get 1918. But we have to add 1 year in order to correct for the fact that there is no year 0 in that calendar. That gives us the year 1919 Common Era as the date when those 2,520 years end, if these 2,520 years are solar years. That's the question. When we travel through time on a calendar, from the times of antiquity we now call BC, before Christ, or BCE, before Common Era, it is not at all like this mathematical scale from -3 on the left, then as we add a 1 to the -3 we go to -2, then to -1, then add 1 more and we end up at 0. Keep adding 1, we arrive at the positive side of the scale at 1, then 2, etc. It's not like that. However, when we look at the Gregorian solar calendar on a timeline similar to that mathematical scale, the midpoint is year 1 AD. Note that most modern references to the Gregorian calendar years usually refer to CE Common Era rather than AD. The years before the birth of Christ are counted downward for many thousands of years before Christ, but note that there is no year 0. Really, year 1 BC is really partially the year 1 AD, or Common Era. When we time travel from BCE, that's before Common Era, meaning before the birth of Jesus in the Gregorian calendar, into the time after Christ, meaning AD or Common Era, we do not pass through a year called 0. There is no such year in the Gregorian calendar or any other. Here I've expanded the scope of this calendar timeline to include from 300 BCE on the left all the way to 500 Common Era or AD on the right, a total span of about 700 years. When we mathematically want to determine the span of time from a date in BC years into CE or AD year, we can subtract one from another, but then we have to add 1 year to the total to rectify for there not being a year 0. An example to calculate the date when adding 600 years to the year 600 BCE, you subtract 200 from 600 to get 400, but then you have to add 1 year to get to the year 401 CE. If there were a year 0 in a calendar, there would not be a need to make such a correction. The Jewish calendar does not have this dilemma, since their calendar is not segmented at all into before Christ or after Christ, obviously. Some have interpreted that the length of a year that should be used to interpret these Bible prophetic time periods should be a lunar year and not a solar year. In this case, because for Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, they used lunar years, which are 354.4 days in length. A solar year is 365.25 days in length. A lunar year is made up of 12 lunar months. Synodic lunar month is the time between two identical phases of the moon, for instance, between two new moons or two full moons, usually 29 or 30 days in length. As mentioned, the lunar year is 354.4 days long. Thus, a lunar year is about 0.9703 of a solar year. A couple FYIs here. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, and the Hebrew calendar is a luni-solar calendar, meaning that they have a combination calendar using lunar months, but correct for a solar year by adding an additional month every 3 years or so. Therefore, the Hebrew calendar is really a solar calendar. A few notes here on the conversion from lunar years and how to apply that to the solar Gregorian calendar that we live with every day here in the United States. Again, a solar year has 365.25 days, and a lunar year is 354.4 days in length. We divide 354.4 days in a lunar calendar by 365.25 days in the solar calendar to get that 0.9703, which is the conversion multiplier constant used to calculate a lunar year based period of time into a solar based Gregorian calendar. Thus, 2,520 lunar years times that constant, conversion constant, 0.9703, equals 2,445 Gregorian calendar solar years. So hopefully you're getting a little glimmer of understanding of what I'm talking about, conversion of lunar into solar years when we're trying to apply lunar length of time onto a solar calendar. To calculate what year we would end in if we use 2,520 lunar years, we use the 2,445 solar years as the equivalent in the Gregorian calendar. So we start with the 2,445, then subtract 602 for the date 602 BCE, and we arrive at 1843. But then we have to add 1 year to correct for there being no year 0 in the transition from BCE into CE on the solar calendar, the Gregorian solar calendar. Thus, 2,520 lunar years from 602 BCE ends in the year 1844 Common Era. But you may still be a little confused, so I'll plot it on a timeline and hope that helps. This kind of messy timeline shows the span of 2,520 years from the Gregorian calendar year of 602 BCE, that's the pink vertical line on the left, when Nebuchadnezzar began his period of 7 times of punishment. But at that same time, humanity began our 7 times period, which is actually a 2,520 year period of time wherein we reaped our punishment for our failure to recognize God's sovereignty and thought ourselves above all. We are King Nebuchadnezzar. Using 2,520 solar years, the green arrow above the timeline, that 2,520 year period of time starting in 602 BCE ended in 1919 Common Era if we use solar years. But if we use 2,520 lunar years of 354.4 days each, that's the white line below the blue timeline. That 2,520 year period ends in 1844 Common Era. I'll break down this messy timeline to clarify things a bit. I've removed the references to the timeline if the 2,520 years were lunar years on the bottom, so that the interpretation using solar years here above the timeline is easier to understand. So if we start at 602 BCE, that year that Nebuchadnezzar's punishment began, then go forward 2,520 solar years, we arrive at the year 1919 Common Era, the vertical green line on the right. What this year could mean will be discussed in a little while. Now I've removed the references to the solar year interpretation. We are starting at that year 602 BCE, but we count lunar years underneath the timeline, the white arrow there, advancing 2,520 lunar years from 602 BC. We arrive at 1844 Common Era, the vertical white line on the right. Again, the 2,520 lunar years are equal to 2,445 solar years on this Gregorian calendar timeline. Obviously, the meaning of the 7 times here no longer refers solely to the 7 years that King Nebuchadnezzar reverted to an animal-like existence. Rather, the 7 times period here refers to the period of time the whole world would revert to an animal-like existence, completely obsessed with our own material existence, not God's sovereignty and how He wants us to act. The end of the 2,520 years is when humanity begins to recognize and live up to our spiritual natures, not just our physical natures. In essence, we begin to grow up. Why am I saying this 2,520 year period involves the whole world and all of humanity, not just a segment of it? Because that was what was stated in the opening verses of Daniel chapter 4. Hopefully you will remember these first 3 verses of Daniel chapter 4. It starts, quote, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are His signs, how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation." End quote. Daniel is announcing to all peoples of the whole world that this dream, meaning prophecy, applies to all peoples, not just the Jewish people. Here, Daniel praises God who has revealed this good news of the future, that it will affect the whole world. God's plans for us 2,520 years after the year 602 BC include all of humanity. And again in verse 25, quote, "7 times will pass by for you until you," humanity, "acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone He wishes." Note, all kingdoms. So the math has led us to 2 different years depending on whether we use a solar year or a lunar year to calculate the span of 2,520 years from 602 BC. Those 2 years were 1919 and 1844 Common Era, respectively. So which is it? The year 1919 or the year 1844? Or maybe somehow both? A review of some key verses is in order here that will give us some clues. First, verse 13, "In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a Holy One, a messenger, coming down from heaven." In verse 16, "Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him." Verse 17, "The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms of earth." And verse 27, "Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." End quote. Then there is verse 15. When the holy ones speak of destroying the great tree, they state, quote, "But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field." End quote. This means that the roots of the Iron and Bronze empires will grow out of the area of the former Neo-Babylonian Empire. If the correct year is 1844 or thereabouts, the math to use for calculating the span of 2,520 years is a lunar year. Thus we arrive at 1844 Common Era. So if this is correct, did anything happen that year that could tie it to any of those verses we reviewed? Around the year 1843, a young man in Shiraz, Persia, became aware that he was the promised Mahdi, a manifestation of God and also the forerunner of another manifestation, who was expected very soon, who would be the Messiah for the new era. This young man was born in 1819 in Shiraz, Persia. His divine title, was the Bab, as you see at the top of this slide. In English, Bab means the gate or the door. He was only about 24 years old when this revelation of his divine identity was revealed to him. He did not immediately publicly proclaim his divine identity as a messenger of God. He made his first public declaration of his divine identity in May 1844. There are more details on the life and proclamation of the Bab in video number 1 of the Book of Daniel series and in other videos on YouTube in my channel that's titled Integral Destiny 9. That's all one word, and don't forget the number 9 at the end. You can find this and many of my other videos there on that channel. There are several other Bible time prophecies that corroborate this 1844 period of time as being when the Messiah would return. That includes the Messiah's forerunner, the expected Elijah figure, who was the Bab. And by the way, people say that, well, the Bible doesn't give the hour or the day of the return of the Messiah. That's true, but it does give the year in several different prophecies, including in Daniel. My video titled Christ Has Returned in my YouTube channel Integral Destiny 9 reviews some of these prophecies and how they pinpoint the 1844 time period for the appearance of the Messiah of the Second Advent. And another video to watch is the one titled The Prophecy of the Seventh Millennium. This 30-minute video titled The Prisoner of Akka is a very informative story of Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the latter days. The video is professionally made and narrated. Pause this video to write down the web address. Note that the address starts with https : and not just http:. Another reason to use lunar years for this calculation is that this prophecy in Daniel is about the area of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, not the future of the Jewish people alone. If it had been for the Jewish people primarily, it probably would be solar years used. However, the 1844 period of time was important to the return of the Jews to the Palestine area too. 1844 was a pivotal year that thereafter an increasing number of Jews were returning to the Holy Land from all over the world. Remember verse 15, quote, "But let the stump of the great tree and its root, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field." End quote. Remember how the iron and bronze are reference to two of the three empires that would replace Nebuchadnezzar's empire, as depicted in his first dream about the statue made of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, with feet of iron and clay. If you remember video number 1, or part number 1, how this empire of iron was a reference to the Islamic empire that would eventually conquer this territory. Islam uses a lunar calendar, so using a lunar calendar in this calculation of the beginning and end of the 2,520 year span of time would be consistent with that. Those are the chief reasons for thinking the year 1844 Common Era and the use of the lunar year in calculations is the correct choice. If not, that both would be correct. So then, what about reasons to use a solar year to calculate the 2,520 year span of time from 602 BCE? The end of 2,520 solar years is 1919 Common Era. The questions that we need to answer include: were there any indications of major advances in the human condition around 1919, or in our spiritual growth in or around or within a few decades even after 1919? Well, World War I ended in November 1918, about 1 month shy of 1919. On the Palestinian front in our area of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, in September 1918, the Allied forces under British leadership saved the life of the leader of the Baha'i faith, the faith established by the new Messiah, and thus saved that infant faith from annihilation. This photo shows Indian Lancers, part of the forces of the United Kingdom, marching into Haifa, Palestine, after its capture in September 1918 under the command of General Allenby. The Allied forces defeated the Ottoman Empire and their German cohorts, and in the process saved the life of Abdu'l-Baha, the head of the Baha'i faith after the passing of the Messiah, and his family, whose lives were threatened by one of the Turkish military leaders in the Haifa area. To see the full story of the saving of the Messiah's new faith, the Baha'i faith, see my video titled Armageddon is Over. It's on my YouTube channel called Integral Destiny 9. Just put that name into the search box on YouTube, Integral Destiny 9, and look for that video, Armageddon is Over. World War I was the crescendo of several hundred of years of continual wars throughout the world. It was supposedly the war to end all wars. Of course, that didn't turn out to be true. But it did make the world truly recognize that we are all on the same small planet. New methods of warfare were introduced in World War I, such as chemical weapons on a large scale, which impacted humanity with these new horrors. Then a couple decades later, World War II. The new horrors of nuclear weapons appeared. Now the whole world got religion, in a sense, about the potential for nuclear warfare and the annihilation of humankind. Not too long after 1919, the United Nations was founded after World War II as humanity matured and realized the need for nations to work together to try to avoid wars in the future. Interreligious disputes and even warfare have occurred, but a steady increase in interfaith communication and even interfaith community has developed since 1919, although interfaith disputes have increased too, due to a rise in fanaticism in most of the previous faiths. The time around 1919 may have been a very significant period, a pivotal point in the maturing of humanity as a whole, thus worthy of being the subject of a Bible prophecy. Could it be that both time periods are correct, both 1844 and 1919? May well be, but I tend to think the best interpretation is the lunar year with the result of 1844. Primarily I choose the 1844 date because that's when the forerunner of the new Messiah proclaimed his identity in May of 1844. And in and around 1919 I have yet to discover anyone who has made claim to being the Messiah, that their claim actually occurred around 1919. So that leaves 1844 to be the most likely choice. A little review here then to sum things up. What have we learned? We now know that references to King Nebuchadnezzar as the subject of the dream are actually references to all of humanity as a whole. We are the ones who would revert to a very unspiritual existence, an animalistic existence, until the end of the 7 times foretold in the dream. We also now know that the period of 7 times of punishment of Nebuchadnezzar, meaning us, for not recognizing God's sovereignty is not 7 earth years, but rather are 7 prophetic years, equaling 2,520 earth years. The beginning of the 2,520 year period was 602 BC, and the end of the 2,520 year period was either 1844 or 1919, or both. And, of course, we also now know what would happen at the end of that period, and that is, the Messiah would appear and the people of the earth would begin to mature spiritually, so as to enter the 7th millennium of raised spiritual consciousness brought by the Messiah. And with that will come God's kingdom on earth. And we now know that the events surrounding the lives of the forerunner, the Bab, and the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah, occurred within the territory covered by the great tree in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Remember that great tree grew out of the territory of the ancient Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar. And remember this map of that empire. The darker blue is the area of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the Middle East. And this is a different map, but it shows that area of the Neo-Babylonian Empire within that purple rectangle, which is the primary areas of the Bab and Baha'u'llah in their lifetimes. Baha'u'llah and the Bab were born in Persia, but forced exiles from the land of his birth sent Baha'u'llah to live in Baghdad, near ancient Babylon, for 10 years. Then ultimately he was last exiled to Akka, Palestine, now Israel, for the last 24 years of his life. He is buried outside of Akka. The Bab's remains were brought from northwest Persia to be buried in Haifa, Palestine in the early 1900s. The world center of the Baha'i faith is located on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Palestine, now Israel. With the appearance of the new Messiah for this era, Baha'u'llah, the glory of God in English, we now have new guidance from God to help us recognize and understand God's sovereignty. Remember, this is what humankind has to do: recognize God's sovereignty and live by his wishes. Daniel's prophecy tells us this would finally happen after the 7 times were over. Here we have a quote from the pen of the new Messiah about God's sovereignty. Quote, "From eternity thou hast been exalted above the praise of all created things, and wilt to eternity remain far above the glorification of any one of thy creatures. Existence itself testifieth to its non-existence when face to face with the manifold revelations of thy transcendent oneness, and every created thing confesseth, by its very nature, its nothingness when compared with the sacred splendors of the light of thy unity." End quote. These photos show the final resting place of God's Messiah of the Second Advent, the Messiah of the 7th millennium. An aerial view is on the left. It shows the sanctuary of Baha'u'llah at the center of the spokes as the walkways converge in the center in the upper part of the photo. That is the sanctuary where it is the final resting place of Baha'u'llah. The photo on the right shows the entrance to his sanctuary. This beautiful and serene spot, so appropriate for God's messenger to humankind for this era, is located outside of Akka, Israel. Note that these holy sites have been in these locations since the late 1890s, well before the nation of Israel was created. The Bab's tomb is in this lovely building on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel, amidst the beautiful gardens which are a well-known location in Haifa. The view at night illustrates the beautiful terraces built up the side of the mountain from bottom to top, honoring the Bab. Here are some buildings that house administrative offices for the world center of the Baha'i community, the worldwide Baha'i community, which now has about 6 million members, spread all over the globe. To learn more about the coming seventh millennium, according to Jewish mysticism and traditions, I invite you to watch my video titled The Prophecy of the Seventh Millennium. Please consider investigating the Baha'i faith and Baha'u'llah's teachings for the new era. You can find a lot more information at these two websites. The top one, bahai.org, is the international website for seekers for information, and the bottom one is bahai.us, is the official website for seekers, those seeking information about the Baha'i faith in the USA. This 30-minute video titled The Prisoner of Akka is a very informative story of Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the latter days. The video is professionally made and narrated. Pause this video to write down the web address. Note that the address starts with https: and not just http:. Now that you have finished part 2 and hopefully part 1, it's time to go on to video number 3, part number 3 of this series of 8 videos on the book of Daniel. Video or part number 3 is about chapter 7, about the 4 beasts that arise from the sea. It would be best to read chapter 7 first. That can be helpful. As I have mentioned before, my videos can be found on my YouTube channel. You go to my channel by going to YouTube and entering into the search box my channel name, which is Integral Destiny 9. Don't forget the 9 at the end. And look for the title of part 3, which is the next one you should watch. But all my videos are accessible through there. And please understand that this video is an amateur production by this singular person, me. It is not an official production for the Baha'i faith or of the Baha'i faith. If there are any errors in it, they are my errors, not theirs. If there are misunderstandings on my part, they are purely on my part. You should do your own research and come to your own conclusions. If you wish to contact me, my email address is there. And of course, thanks for watching.